October 1942. The Solomon Islands. A stretch of dark ocean the sailors called Iron Bottom Sound, because so many ships had already sunk there. The water looked calm from a distance, but every man serving in those waters knew the truth. Night after night, war moved silently through the darkness. Just after midnight, a small American patrol torpedo boat cut through the black water. The wooden hull slapped against the waves as the engines hummed quietly. On the bridge, officers stared into the darkness, trying to see shapes before those shapes saw them. Then it happened. A sudden flash lit up the ocean. Not a small spark. A rolling explosion that turned the water orange and threw debris into the air. Burning fuel spread across the surface like fire on glass. For a moment, the entire formation of boats became visible in the glow. Japanese machine gun fire followed immediately. Bright tracer rounds streaked across the water in glowing lines, skipping across the surface like stones. The bullets were not random. They were walking slowly toward the American boats. One patrol boat took hits near its engine compartment. Another was struck along the side of its wooden hull. Both boats turned hard and pulled away, engines roaring as they escaped the line of fire. But the Japanese barges kept moving. They always kept moving. Every night those barges came down through the narrow waters between the Solomon Islands. The Americans called this route the slot. The Japanese called it a supply lifeline. Each barge carried around 60 soldiers. Many also carried ammunition, food, and equipment for the Japanese forces fighting on the island of Guadalcanal. The island had become one of the most important battlefields in the Pacific, and the American Navy had a serious problem. They could not stop the barges. On paper, the United States Navy had the perfect weapon for stopping enemy ships. The small patrol torpedo boats, called PT boats, were designed specifically to attack larger vessels at night. Each boat carried heavy torpedoes. These torpedoes weighed over 2,000 pounds and carried powerful explosive warheads. One hit could sink a destroyer. In theory, the barges should have been easy targets. In reality, nothing worked. During the 60 days between August and October of 1942, American PT boat crews fired 41 torpedoes at Japanese supply barges around Guadalcanal. 41. Every torpedo represented a powerful weapon carefully aimed at a slow-moving target. The result? Not a single confirmed barge destroyed. Not one. The problem was painfully simple once the crews realized what was happening. The torpedoes were designed to travel several feet under the water before striking a ship's hull. That worked perfectly against large vessels like cruisers or destroyers. But Japanese supply barges were small and shallow. They only sat about 5 feet in the water. American torpedoes passed harmlessly under them every time. The crews knew it. The officers knew it. But the missions continued anyway, because no better option existed. And torpedoes were not the only weapon on the boats. Each PT boat also carried heavy machine guns. These guns could fire hundreds of rounds every minute. But the barges had a small advantage. Their hulls were protected with thin steel armor plates. The armor was not thick enough to stop heavy naval guns, but it was strong enough to stop rifle bullets and machine gun fire. American crews watched their rounds hit the steel plating, throwing sparks into the night and doing almost nothing else. Some desperate crews even tried mounting small anti-tank guns onto the bows of their boats. The guns were powerful, that they had to be reloaded manually after every shot. The idea worked in theory. In practice, it meant standing on the deck of a small wooden boat while enemy machine guns fired directly at you. It was not a solution. It was desperation. By mid-October, the numbers were becoming hard to ignore. 6 PT boats had already been destroyed in barge encounters. 17 American sailors were dead, and the Japanese supply runs continued almost every night. The barges carried soldiers and supplies that allowed Japanese forces on Guadalcanal to continue fighting. Every successful supply run meant the battle would last longer and cost more lives. The situation was becoming critical. Many officers believed the problem had no real solution. PT boats carried torpedoes and machine guns. Those were the weapons they were designed to use. If those weapons failed, then the mission simply could not be accomplished. Most people accepted that conclusion, but one young officer refused to. Lieutenant Robert Lynch was 26 years old. Before the war, he had studied electrical engineering in Pennsylvania. He had never designed weapons and had no special training in naval combat tactics, but he had a particular habit that sometimes made him unpopular with people who preferred simple answers. He did not accept problems that everyone else considered impossible. Instead, he tried to understand why they were impossible. For several weeks, Lynch had watched the same pattern repeat during night patrols. The boats detected barges. The torpedoes missed. Machine guns failed. Japanese return fire forced the Americans to retreat. Every patrol ended the same way. Lynch began thinking about the problem in the quiet hours between missions. While others slept, he replayed the situation in his mind again and again. He believed the failure came from one assumption everyone had accepted without questioning. That assumption was simple. PT boats had only two useful weapons: torpedoes and machine guns. If those weapons could not destroy the barges, then nothing could. Lynch wondered if that assumption was wrong. The island of Guadalcanal was the center of the entire campaign. American Marines had captured a small airfield there earlier in the war. The airfield was called Henderson Field. From the air, it looked like a thin strip of pale coral cutting across the jungle. American aircraft operated from it constantly, defending the island against Japanese attacks. But the airfield had become something else as well, a graveyard. Japanese bombers attacked the field almost daily. American aircraft scrambled to intercept them, and dogfights often filled the sky above the island. Many planes returned damaged. Some never made it back into the air again. The edges of the runway were lined with wrecked aircraft. Fighters that had crash-landed or been damaged beyond repair. Mechanics stripped useful equipment from the wrecks and used the parts to keep other planes flying. Most people saw those broken aircraft as scrap metal. Lynch saw something else. One morning in October 1942, Lynch walked across Henderson Field. He stepped around shattered wings and broken propellers. Sunlight reflected off twisted aluminum, scattered across the coral ground. He was not looking for anything specific. He was simply asking himself a question: what weapons existed that could destroy a steel-armored barge? Machine guns could not. Torpedoes passed underneath. So what else existed? The answer appeared in front of him almost by accident. A wrecked fighter plane sat near the edge of the runway. The aircraft had crashed days earlier and now rested with its nose buried in the coral. The wings were bent. The engine was dead, but something in the nose of the aircraft caught Lynch's attention: a cannon. Unlike most fighters of the time, this aircraft carried a large automatic cannon mounted in its nose. The weapon had originally been designed to destroy enemy aircraft and light armored vehicles. It fired explosive shells at extremely high speed. Lynch stared at it for a long time. He began doing the math in his head. The cannon could fire dozens of explosive rounds in seconds. Those rounds were powerful enough to penetrate light armor. A Japanese supply barge carried only thin steel plates. Suddenly, the problem looked different. The weapon he needed already existed. It was sitting inside a wrecked airplane. The only real question was whether anyone would allow him to try something completely unexpected. And that question would lead to one of the most unusual improvisations of the entire Pacific War. When Robert Lynch looked at the cannon mounted in the nose of the wrecked fighter, the idea seemed almost obvious. But obvious ideas are not always easy to turn into reality. The weapon he was looking at had never been used on a naval boat. It had been designed for aircraft. The recoil system, the mounting structure, and the ammunition feed were all built to work inside the frame of a fighter plane. A small wooden patrol boat was something completely different. Still, the more Lynch thought about it, the more the idea refused to leave his mind. If that cannon could fire explosive rounds directly into the thin steel hull of a Japanese barge, the result would be devastating. Not one round, not one carefully aimed shot, but dozens of explosive shells fired in rapid succession. A single barge could be destroyed in seconds. The problem was getting the weapon off the aircraft and mounting it onto a boat that had never been designed to carry something like it. And there was another problem: time. Japanese barges were running every night. Every delay meant more soldiers and supplies reaching Guadalcanal, and Lynch could not wait weeks for official approval. He needed an answer immediately. Ideas alone do not win battles. People do. Lynch knew he needed mechanics who understood the aircraft and machinists who could build something strong enough to hold the cannon. The first person he found was an aircraft armorer named Technical Sergeant James Coogan. Coogan had spent years working with fighter aircraft before the war. He understood the weapons mounted on them better than almost anyone at Henderson Field. When Lynch explained what he wanted to do, Coogan did not laugh. Instead, he walked over to the wrecked aircraft and studied the cannon mount carefully. The weapon was an automatic aircraft cannon capable of firing explosive shells at high velocity. It had a hydraulic recoil system that absorbed much of the force created during firing. That recoil system was important. Without it, the weapon might tear itself loose from whatever mount they built. Coogan looked back at Lynch and gave a simple answer. Removing the cannon was possible. Mounting it on a PT boat would be much harder, but not impossible. That was enough for Lynch. Later that afternoon, a small group of sailors and mechanics gathered around the wrecked aircraft. They brought tools, cutting torches, and whatever equipment they could find. None of them had official instructions for what they were doing. They were simply trying to solve a problem. The first step was disconnecting the cannon from the aircraft. The weapon had been mounted deep inside the nose of the plane and secured with heavy steel bolts. Years of heat, corrosion, and impact damage had made those bolts difficult to remove. The mechanics worked slowly. First, they disconnected hydraulic lines that controlled the recoil system. Then they removed electrical wires connected to the firing mechanism. Finally, they began loosening the bolts. Some refused to move. Without proper tools or lubricants, the mechanics improvised. They used fuel to loosen rusted thread, said, and waited patiently before trying again. One by one, the bolts came loose. Once the final connection was cut, the cannon slid free from the wrecked aircraft. It was heavy, much heavier than anyone expected. Several men had to lift it together and carry it away from the plane. By evening, they had removed not just one cannon, but several from other damaged aircraft nearby. Some were too damaged to use, but at least one was still in excellent condition. That was enough to continue. Now came the difficult part. The cannon had to be mounted onto the bow of a PT boat. The boats were built from wood and designed to carry machine guns and torpedoes, not heavy automatic cannons. If the mount failed, the recoil could rip the weapon free from the deck. To solve that problem, Lynch turned to a machinist named Donald Frey. Frey was not a weapons engineer. He was a machinist who had spent many years working with metal and understanding how structures handled stress. When Lynch explained the situation, Frey did not begin with complicated calculations. Instead, he grabbed a piece of scrap aluminum and a grease pencil. In less than an hour, he sketched a design. The idea was simple. A heavy steel base plate would be bolted directly to the reinforced frame of the boat's bow. From that base plate, a vertical steel pipe would rise upward, supporting a rotating collar that allowed the cannon to turn from side to side. On top of that collar would sit a cradle holding the cannon itself. The design was crude compared to factory equipment, but it had one important advantage. It could be built using materials already available. Pieces of steel were salvaged from damaged landing gear and scrap metal lying around Henderson Field. A small machine shop at the airfield became the construction site. The shop contained basic tools, one lathe, a drill press, and welding equipment powered by a generator T. Had frequently overheated in the tropical heat. The men worked through the evening. They cut steel plates, welded pipe sections together, and shaped to the rotating collar that would allow the cannon to move. The work was not elegant. The welds were rough, and the metal surfaces uneven. But Frey's design was strong. By late evening, the first mount was complete. The cannon and its mount were loaded onto a truck and transported down the rough road leading to the docks. At the waterfront, Lynch's PT boat waited. The crew had already prepared the bow of the boat by reinforcing the wooden deck with additional framing beneath the mounting area. Installing the mount required drilling several large holes through thick layers of wood and structural beams. The sailors used a hand-powered drill. It was slow work. Each hole took nearly half an hour. After several hours of effort, the base plate was finally bolted securely to the deck. Next came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The cannon was lifted onto the mount and carefully secured in place. For the first time, an aircraft cannon sat on the bow of a PT boat. The weapon rotated. It elevated. The mechanism worked, but there were still problems. The aircraft cannon used magazines designed to fit inside the fighter plane's fuselage. A PT boat had no space designed for those magazines. The crew solved the problem in the simplest way possible. They stacked loaded magazines directly on the deck next to the cannon. During combat, a crew member would grab a magazine and insert it into the weapon whenever the previous one ran empty. It was not elegant, but it would work. The final step was choosing someone to operate the weapon. The job went to gunner's mate Harold Mitchell, Mitchell had experience firing heavy machine guns during combat patrols, but he had never fired an aircraft cannon before. In fact, nobody on the boat had. Techni, Call Sergeant Coogan, gave him a quick lesson that lasted only a few minutes. He explained how to load the magazine, how to operate the trigger, and how the recoil system functioned. That was the entire training session. The crew had no opportunity to test fire the weapon. There was no firing range and no spare ammunition for practice. The first time the cannon would be fired would be during combat. Late that night, the PT boat prepared to leave the harbor. The crew looked at the strange new weapon mounted on their bow. Some were excited. Others were nervous. No one knew what would happen when the cannon fired. Would the mount hold? Would the recoil damage the deck? Would the weapon even function correctly? Those questions had no answers yet, but the Japanese barges would be running again that night. And for the first time, the Americans had a weapon that might actually stop them. As the engine started and the boat moved into the darkness, Robert Lynch stood on the bridge, watching the black water ahead. Somewhere out there, the barges were coming. Within a few hours, the new weapon would face its first test. If it worked, everything in the Solomon Islands might change. If it failed, nothing would, and the crew of that small wooden boat would be the first to find out which outcome was waiting in the darkness. The night was dark over Iron Bottom Sound. Clouds covered the moon, and the only light came from distant stars reflected in the water. For the sailors on the small American patrol boat, that darkness was both protection and danger. It was protection because darkness hid them from enemy ships. It was danger because it hid the enemy as well. Robert Lynch stood on the bridge of the PT boat, watching the horizon carefully. The engines were running quietly as the boat moved through the water at reduced speed. Behind him on the bow, Harold Mitchell sat next to the strange, new weapon mounted to the deck. The aircraft cannon looked almost out of place on the wooden boat. 6 magazines of ammunition were stacked beside it. Each one held 30 explosive shells. Mitchell checked the weapon again. He had never fired it before, but tonight would not give him a choice. Near midnight, the radar operator called out from inside the small cabin. Surface contacts. Several of them. They were moving slowly. Lynch adjusted the course of the boat and headed toward the radar signal. As the distance closed, the shapes of the targets slowly appeared against the darker water. Japanese supply barges, 4 of them moving in a line. Each barge carried soldiers and supplies destined for Guadalcanal. The PT boat continued forward. At first, the barges did not notice them. Then, one of the Japanese crews spotted the approaching boat. Machine guns opened fire. Bright tracer rounds streaked across the water, glowing orange in the darkness. The bullets splashed into the sea just short of the PT boat. Lynch did not turn away. He pushed the boat closer. 800 yards, 700, 600. Mitchell waited behind the cannon, his hands on the weapon. At around 800 yards, Lynch gave the order. Mitchell pulled the trigger. The cannon exploded with light and sound. The muzzle flash lit up the entire bow of the boat like a camera flash in the night. The recoil slammed backward into the mount, shaking the deck beneath Mitchell's feet. For a moment, nobody knew if the mount would hold. It did. The cannon continued firing. Explosive shells streaked across the water and slammed into the lead barge. The first rounds punched through the thin steel armor easily. The next shell detonated inside the barge's cargo area. A sudden fireball erupted from the center of the vessel. Fuel tanks ignited. Flames shot upward as soldiers jumped into the water to escape the burn. In barge. Mitchell kept firing until the first magazine was empty. 30 rounds had been fired in only seconds. The lead barge was already sinking. Mitchell pulled the empty magazine free and grabbed another from the deck beside him. He slammed it into place and pulled the charging handle. The second barge was turning, trying to escape the attack. Mitchell swung the cannon toward it and fired again. More shells struck the barge, along its engine compartment. Explosions tore through the structure. Smoke and fire filled the air as the engine stopped and the vessel drifted helplessly in the water. Within less than 2 minutes, 2 barges had been destroyed. A third was heavily damaged. The PT boat had not taken a single serious hit. For weeks, the American sailors had watched their torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath the barges. Now one improvised weapon had done what 41 torpedoes could not. By morning, the report of the engagement had spread through the PT boat squadron. Every commander wanted the same weapon installed on his boat. The results were impossible to ignore. 2 barges destroyed, 1 disabled, 0 American casualties, but success created a new problem. The weapon had never been officially approved. According to Navy regulations, modifications like this required authorization from higher command. Without that approval, the entire experiment could be shut down. Commander Alan Calvert, who commanded the PT boat squadron in the region, faced a difficult decision. He could report the modification and risk having it banned, or he could continue installing the cannons and hope the results spoke for themselves. Calvert chose the second option. More wrecked aircraft were searched at Henderson Field. More cannons were removed. Mechanics and machinists repeated the process of building mounts and installing the weapons on additional boats. Within days, several PT boats were operating with aircraft cannons mounted on their bows, and the results kept improving. Not everyone supported the idea. Far away from the combat zone, Navy officials responsible for weapon systems raised concerns. The aircraft cannon had never been designed for naval use. The improvised mount had not been tested in any official engineering program. If the weapon malfunctions or damaged a boat, the responsibility would fall on the officers who had authorized its installation. Some officials believed the modification was reckless, but the officers in the Solomon Islands had something more powerful than arguments. They had results. During the first weeks of combat operations using the cannon, PD boats destroyed multiple Japanese barges that previously would have escaped without damage. Supply runs were being disrupted. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were losing equipment and soldiers before they even reached the island. Eventually, the data reached higher command. One naval weapons analyst carefully reviewed the reports, maintenance records, and combat results. His conclusion was simple. The installation was not perfect, but it worked. After several weeks of evaluation, the Navy finally approved the use of aircraft cannons on PT boats. The decision came much faster than anyone expected. The results were too clear to ignore. Soon, dozens of PT boats began receiving similar weapons. Some used salvaged aircraft cannons. Others received improved mounts designed by engineers based on the original field design. What had started as an improvised experiment was becoming official equipment. The night war in the Solomon Islands was changing. Japanese commanders soon realized something had changed. Their barges were no longer safe. Explosive shells could now punch through their armor and detonate inside the hulls. Some convoys began traveling with destroyer escorts to the barges, but that created another problem. PT boats were fast. They could slip through darkness, attack quickly, and disappear before larger ships could react. American commanders began developing new tactics. Instead of a single boat attacking alone, multiple PT boats would operate together. One boat might distract enemy escorts while another closed in on the barges with the cannon. The tactics worked. More barges were destroyed. More supply missions failed. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal began receiving fewer supplies and fewer reinforcements. By early 1943, the effects of the new weapon were becoming clear. Japanese supply operations in the region were under constant threat. Many barge crews refused to enter certain areas at night after repeated attacks. Every destroyed barge meant fewer soldiers and less ammunition reaching the island. Eventually, the Japanese command realized their position on Guadalcanal was becoming impossible to maintain. Without reliable supply lines, their forces could not continue fighting effectively. In February 1943, Japan evacuated thousands of troops from the island. The campaign for Guadalcanal was effectively over. Large battleships and aircraft carriers played major roles in the campaign, but small patrol boats and one improvised weapon had also played a part. After the war ended, the men who had created the cannon installation returned to ordinary lives. Robert Lynch left the Navy and returned to engineering work in the United States. He rarely spoke publicly about the events of the war. Harold Mitchell continued serving for a time and later worked in the aviation industry, applying the same mechanical knowledge that had helped him operate the cannon in combat. Donald Frey, the machinist who designed the mount, returned to civilian work in shipyards. James Coogan continued his career, maintaining military aircraft. None of them became famous. Their work appeared in technical reports and maintenance logs rather than in headlines. Yet their improvisation influenced naval tactics for years after the war. The success of the aircraft cannon on PT boats eventually led to the development of factory-built versions specifically designed for naval use. Later patrol craft used similar weapons in other conflicts, including operations during the Korean War. The basic idea remained the same. A weapon designed for one platform could be adapted for another when the situation demanded it. The story began with a simple observation on a damaged airfield. A wrecked aircraft still carried a weapon capable of fighting. Most people saw the wreck as useless scrap. Robert Lynch saw a solution. Within hours, that solution had been turned into a working weapon. Within months, it had changed the way small naval boats fought at night. And in the waters around Guadalcanal, that single idea helped stop an enemy supply line that had once seemed unstoppable.